Bruce Lee died on a film set before his final movie was released. His son, Brandon Lee, died on a film set before his final movie was released. Bruce was 32. Brandon was 28. 20 years apart. Two men, one family, and a pattern so precise that even people who don't believe in curses have trouble explaining it. This is the story of the Lee family and of the two deaths that turned a dynasty into a legend that the world has never been able to fully put down. To understand what happened to Brandon Lee, you first have to understand what it meant to grow up as his father's son. Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973. Brandon was 8 years old. He would later describe his father not as a man he remembered clearly, but as a presence, a force that existed in film and in the stories other people told, in the way strangers reacted when they heard his last name, in the weight that came with carrying it. He grew up in a household shaped by absence. His mother, Linda, kept the family together with a quiet strength that those who knew her described as extraordinary. His sister Shannon was too young to have any real memory of their father at all. Brandon was the one who sat in between, old enough to remember something, young enough that the something was already fading into myth before he could hold on to it. He watched his father's films the way other children watched cartoons. He rewound the fight scenes not once but dozens of times. He studied the movement, the speed, the particular quality of attention that Bruce Lee brought to every frame. That quality of being so completely present in a moment that the camera could not help but find him, could not look anywhere else. Bruce Lee on screen was not performing, he was simply there, more fully than most human beings are capable of being anywhere. Brandon saw all of this from the outside, the way any audience member saw it, because he had lost the inside version, the father at breakfast, the father at rest, the father's voice in the ordinary moments of a day, before he was old enough to store it properly. The man he knew was the man on the screen, the same man millions of strangers knew. It was a strange kind of intimacy, total and completely impersonal at the same time. As he grew older, the comparisons were inevitable and relentless. Every journalist who interviewed him, every casting director who considered him, every audience member who watched him perform was, on some level, performing the same calculation, measuring him against a man who died at 32 and therefore existed only at his peak, frozen in those final years when everything he had been building his whole life had finally converged. Brandon was being compared not to a father who aged and changed and had bad days, but to an icon. The icon always wins. He was determined to step out of the shadow, not by rejecting his father. He spoke about Bruce with genuine love and pride, and the love was real, not performed, but by being something different enough that the comparison eventually became irrelevant. He took acting seriously in a way that went beyond the obvious commercial motivation. He studied the craft. He took classes. He worked with coaches. He was interested in the internal life of characters in a way that his father, whose genius was primarily physical and philosophical rather than theatrical, had never needed to be. He had his own quality on screen, something less contained than his father, more openly emotional, less like a coiled spring, and more like a man willing to be seen in the process of becoming. Directors who worked with him noticed it. They said he was getting somewhere, that the real thing was emerging from underneath the shadow of the name.
By the early 1990s, Brandon Lee was on the verge of something real. He had appeared in Kung Fu the movie. He had starred in Showdown in Little Tokyo and Rapid Fire. He was building a career that was beginning to stand on its own terms, rather than leaning on borrowed legend. And then, in 1993, he landed the role that everyone around him believed would complete the transformation. He was cast as Eric Draven in The Crow, a gothic, atmospheric film about a rock musician murdered alongside his fiancée, who returns from the dead to seek justice. It was a dark, ambitious project, unlike anything Brandon had done before. It suited him. The people on set could see it happening, watch him finding the character, making it his. Filming took place in Wilmington, North Carolina. The production ran on a tight budget and an aggressive schedule. The crew was working long hours under difficult conditions, shooting night scenes in cold, wet weather, pushing through a schedule that left little room for the kind of careful procedural checks that keep people alive on film sets. It was the last week of March 1993. Brandon was almost done. The film was almost finished. He was 6 days from completing the work. The scene being filmed that night required a prop gun, a gun loaded with blank cartridges designed to produce the flash and noise of a real gunshot without a lethal projectile. In the weeks prior, the same gun had been used in other scenes, and at some point during those earlier uses, a bullet tip had become lodged deep inside the barrel. Nobody noticed. Nobody checked. The prop department, working fast and under pressure, had not inspected the weapon with the rigor that the situation demanded. When the blank cartridge was fired for Brandon's scene, the gunpowder propelled the lodged bullet tip forward with enough force to be lethal. Brandon Lee was shot in the abdomen. He was rushed to the hospital. He underwent emergency surgery for 12 hours. He died on April 1st, 1993. He was 28 years old. He was 6 days from the end of filming. The film was completed using a combination of already shot footage, a body double, and digital effects, technology that was barely mature enough for the task, but that the production team pushed to its absolute limits out of a determination to honor what Brandon had already built. The Crow was released in May 1994. It became an instant cult classic, a film that has never gone out of print, never stopped finding new audiences across new generations, never stopped being recognized as the defining work of a man who never got to see it. The parallels to his father's death are not subtle, and they are not a matter of interpretation. They are factual. Bruce Lee died in July 1973, 6 days before the release of Enter the Dragon, the film that made him the first Asian actor to carry a Hollywood production and that remains one of the most influential action films ever made. Brandon Lee died in March 1993, 6 days before the completion of The Crow, the film that was making him a genuine star entirely separate from his father's name. Both films became cultural landmarks. Both men never saw them released. Both died young, in the middle of the work, with everything still ahead of them. The causes of death were different. Bruce Lee died from cerebral edema, swelling of the brain triggered by a reaction to a painkiller, under circumstances that were investigated thoroughly and ruled accidental, but that have generated speculation for 50 years without resolution. The theories range from the medically plausible, heat stroke, an undetected cardiovascular condition, a drug interaction that the medicine of 1973 was not equipped to fully understand, to the more extraordinary, assassination ordered by criminal organizations in Hong Kong who had reason to want him gone, retribution from traditional martial arts communities who viewed his willingness to teach non-Chinese students as a betrayal that deserved punishment, a supernatural consequence of purchasing a home on land that local tradition held to be permanently cursed. In 2018, the biographer Matthew Pauly consulted with modern medical experts and put forward a compelling case that heat stroke was the most likely true cause, a condition poorly understood at the time and therefore not considered during the original investigation. This theory has gained significant credibility. None of the others have ever been substantiated. None of them have ever gone fully away, because the human mind, confronted with a loss this large, does not accept randomness easily.
Brandon Lee's death was ruled an accident following the investigation into the prop gun failure. The production company faced serious scrutiny for the safety failures that allowed a live round to reach a working set. No criminal charges were ever filed. The specific mechanical sequence that caused the tragedy was documented and established with reasonable clarity. But even with the mechanics understood, the questions accumulated. How had nobody checked the weapon? How many times had the gun been used before that night without anyone discovering the obstruction? What combination of budget pressure, schedule pressure, and institutional carelessness had created the conditions for a failure that should have been impossible? In Hong Kong, and among people who had grown up inside the cultural framework Bruce Lee had inhabited his whole life, a simpler explanation was offered. The family had purchased property in Hong Kong on land that traditional Feng Shui understanding held to carry bad wind, a location where the spiritual geography was wrong in ways that would bring misfortune to those who built there. The death of Bruce had been a warning that went unheeded. The death of Brandon, 20 years later, was understood as confirmation. This was not superstition in a dismissive Western sense. It was a coherent framework for making meaning from losses that seemed, by any rational accounting, too precisely shaped to be random. A father and a son, the same industry, the same final film pattern, the same devastating early exit, the same family left behind to carry what remained. What no theory, rational or otherwise, can fully account for is the human weight of what the Lee family endured. Linda Lee Cadwell lost her husband in 1973. She was in her 20s. She raised 2 children alone, managed Bruce's estate and legacy through decades of changing tastes and cultural shifts, protected his work from exploitation, and built a life from the ruins of a loss that would have broken most people permanently. And then, in 1993, she lost her son. The same woman, 2 decades later. The grief of the second arrived with a particular cruelty, the knowledge that she had already survived something unsurvivable once, and that the years she had spent rebuilding had not been enough to protect against another version of the same devastation. Shannon Lee was 2 years old when her father died. She was 23 when she lost her brother. Her entire adult life has been built on the foundation of 2 absences so enormous that most people would have collapsed under the weight of just one of them. She did not collapse. She became the keeper of Bruce Lee's legacy, not out of obligation, but out of something that looked more like love with a mission attached to it, producing the Warrior television series that her father had conceived in the early 1970s and never seen realized. A project that finally reached screens in 2019, 48 years after Bruce first brought the idea to Warner Bros. And was told America wasn't ready for it. She manages the Bruce Lee Foundation, makes careful and deliberate decisions about what her father's name is attached to and what it is not, and has spent decades in interviews and public appearances insisting, gently but consistently, that Bruce Lee was a human being first and an icon second, and that the human being is the more interesting story. She has spoken about Brandon with the same directness, not with the polished distance of someone performing grief for an audience, but with the specific, particular honesty of someone who actually lost someone. She has talked about missing him in the ordinary way, missing a person, not a symbol. Missing the brother who would have grown older, who would have called on Sundays, who would have had opinions on films and argued about them, who would have been present in the small, continuous texture of a shared life.
In 2013, on what would have been Brandon's 48th birthday, she wrote publicly about him. She said she missed him. She said she wished he had gotten to grow old. She thought about the career he would have had, the roles he would have played, the person he would have become beyond the image frozen by his death at 28. This is the private truth underneath the mythology of the Lee family curse. It is not about curses. It is about 2 people who were in the middle of becoming who they were going to be, and who were stopped before anyone could see the full shape of it. Bruce Lee became immortal because he died at the exact moment his greatest work was reaching the world. The compression of his life into those final extraordinary years, the Hong Kong films, Enter the Dragon, the philosophy of Jeet Kune Do, the physical achievements that people are still trying to fully explain, created an image so concentrated, so perfectly complete in its incompleteness, that it has never diluted across 50 years of being reproduced and referenced and argued over. Brandon Lee was on the verge of something similar. The Crow gave the world a glimpse of who he was becoming, emotionally open in a way his father's screen persona never was, electric in the dark, atmospheric world of the film, committed to a character in a way that owed nothing to his inheritance and everything to the work he had done on his own. What the film cannot show is what would have come next, the range he would have discovered, the collaborators he would have found, the films that would have existed only because he existed to make them, what he would have built in the decade after The Crow and the decade after that. That is what was lost, not icons, people. A father who was 32 and had everything still ahead of him. A son who was 28 and had just begun to show what he was made of. Both gone before their final films could reach the world. Both survived by a mother and a sister who have spent decades carrying them forward, not as myths, not as marketing, but as people who were loved and who are missed in the specific, irreplaceable way that real people are missed when they are gone. That is the real story of the Lee family, not the curse, the people.